evening and welcome to the Borders on project. Today we discuss very interesting developments in several countries and relations between the United States with Russia, Georgia, and maybe we'll have some minutes to discuss what's going on in Belarus Republic because it's also very interesting. My special guest today is former United States Assistant Secretary of State, Mr. Дэвид Крамер. Mr. Крамер, welcome to the Border Zone again.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
How are you there in Washington in regard with coronavirus? Is it getting better?
Actually, I'm in Miami, and
you're in Miami.
The situation here is not good at all. The numbers in Florida have really been increasing significantly, and other states in the United States, Texas, Arizona, California, sort of the whole southern part and the western part of the United States. So in Washington, it's a little better, and in the Northeast, where it was very bad early on, it's gotten a little better, but we're having a major crisis here with the COVID-19 situation, and unfortunately, I fear the lack of strong leadership from our officials is not helping the situation.
Yeah, that's really sounds very unfortunate, and I could only wish you all the best and America all the best in regard to this big issue we all face at the moment. Could you please tell me, the first thing I would like to ask you about is, of course, this so-called results of this so-called voting in Russia to allow Mr. Putin live long and a good life. So could you please evaluate this huge victory, both in regard just inside Russia's politics and in regard US-Russia relations?
It's hard to take what happened over the past couple of months because this started in January with proposals for changes to the Constitution. That didn't generate much enthusiasm and support. And so we saw in March, Mr. Putin, through his stooges in the Russian Duma, become much more explicit that this whole idea is the way for him to remain in power up possibly until 2036 by erasing the terms that he has already served as president, since the Constitution limits a person to only 2 consecutive terms to serve as president, to enable him to start from zero, where he can basically run again in 2024 and 2036. And since the presidential term was lengthened to 6 years when Medvedev was keeping the seat warm as president, there's the possibility that Putin, in this scenario, could be president for 36 years, which is just mind-boggling for, I think, everyone to contemplate. And the nationwide vote, it wasn't a referendum, because I think the government and the Kremlin were worried they could not generate enough of a turnout to justify holding a referendum. But after the changes were rammed through the Duma, after they were rammed through the Federation Council, after they were rammed through a majority of the regions, Putin felt he wanted the patina of legitimacy that would come through a nationwide vote. And so that was unveiled over the course of the past week, and results were announced actually before the voting concluded, where the officials said that there was 68% turnout and 78% of those actually voted to support the constitutional changes, which included, by the way, not just enabling Putin to serve for 2 more terms, but that would ban gay marriage, that would make Russian language the really only official language, a host of other things, including a boost in pensions and other kinds of benefits to the population. It was a totally rigged process. It was a totally rigged outcome yesterday. And I think no Western leader should offer any congratulations to Mr. Putin. If you remember, there was controversy following the March 2018 presidential election, after which President Trump, despite having been warned by his advisors not to congratulate Putin, did in fact congratulate Putin. I certainly hope that President Trump doesn't offer congratulations now, particularly in light of other problems that exist in the U.S.-Russia relationship, which we can get into.
Could you please tell me, do you think that it will somehow change the rules of the game? I mean, behavior of Russian government? Will it make Russia more democratic country, as Putin states all the time, with power distributed among different institutions? Or this legitimacy to be a president for many, many years will make him even more tough?
It's certainly not going to make the situation in Russia more democratic. It paves the way for Putin possibly to stay in power for 16 more years. And it's absurd to think that this is a democratic process, that the vote of the people lends it this legitimacy. This was rigged from the beginning. And opposition forces, of course, have been intimidated, harassed, in some cases tragically killed, forced to leave the country, to operate from overseas. And there is no tolerance for criticism beyond some token representatives. And so I think that this process is designed to enable Putin to stay in power because he cannot afford to give up power. He has become a hostage in some ways to his own system and is afraid that if he were to surrender the reins of power, that he could fall victim to the system that he has created. A system that the foundation for which was laid but in the Yeltsin years, to be clear. But so I think that this is a step backward for Russia. It is a sign that Putin has no ideas, no vision. The country, of course, is dealing with a crisis. We're dealing with a pandemic in the United States. Russia is dealing with a crisis of the pandemic as well. Putin and Trump, oddly enough, are taking similar positions, which is they're basically just trying to ignore it, pretending that it's over, that the worst is past. Of course, this vote was supposed to have been held in April. It had to be postponed because of the pandemic. And he forced local leaders to present the best face of the handling of the situation in order to pave the way for this vote that occurred over a week-long period because it wasn't safe to have what they hoped would have been a flood of people showing up July 1st. But in fact, there really wasn't a flood of people doing so. The instances of fraud, voter abuse, administrative resources, there were booklets of the new Constitution already printed before the vote was even took place. And so the whole thing was anti-democratic and moving Russia, sadly, into a more authoritarian direction.
I'm sure that you also took part in some discussions. Now it's very vividly discussed both in Ukraine and in Georgia that with such kind of crisis, economical crisis, financial crisis in Russia, issues in regard with epidemic and other like issues they face at the moment, Putin may need some new fast and successful war against neighbors. It could be some enlargement of troops in Ukraine or something else. Do you like consider such an option for Putin to make his rating higher now?
I think it would be a mistake to rule out any possibility. Putin clearly has no vision to help get Russia's economy back on track. This has been true not just because of the economic crisis as a result of the pandemic that forced a partial shutdown of parts of the economy. This has been true since 2013 before he went into Ukraine. And the problem has been from day one, Putin's failure to move Russia into a more diversified direction away from reliance on natural resources, in particular energy. The Russian economy is heavily dependent. The Russian state budget is heavily dependent on the export of oil and gas. And Putin has not moved Russia away from that dependence. The economy benefited when the price of oil went up soon after Putin became president. But as we've seen with the drop in the price of oil, a price that Putin can't control, we have seen Russia's economy suffer. And so Putin has no vision for how to move Russia's economy in a more modern, positive direction. He has no vision for how to address the problems of inequality in Russia, of how to help societies and communities that live in one industry towns that are dying out. He has no vision because he's been in power too long. He's already been there for 20 years, and I include the 4 years that he effectively served as prime minister when he was still essentially calling the shots. And so all he seems interested in is staying in power, accumulating wealth, and that's why this whole process was launched. And so when he has no vision for how to fix the problems in Russia, as he did in 2014, he might try to attack another neighbor or renew or accelerate or increase the war in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass region, possibly increase tensions in Georgia. We already see the demarcation line in Georgia moving more and more into Georgian-controlled territory. Belarus is another possibility that we have to keep an eye on, where even though the passage of these constitutional amendments enables Putin to stay in power, and the thinking was that a Belarus-Russia union would be the path for Putin to stay in power, it's possible Putin will think, well, my numbers are dropping despite the announced vote yesterday. Levada Center polls have shown this drop in support for him. I need to do something to rally patriotism, to rally people behind me. Maybe a push into Belarus could be that. So I don't think we can rule anything out when it comes to Putin's desperation to maintain support as he sees the numbers, the polling numbers drop.
But the United States will certainly still cooperate with Russia as they did before, right? And with President Putin, not Russia.
It is, I mean, we are in a bizarre state of affairs in the U.S.-Russian relationship, if you can even call it a relationship. The Trump administration has adopted certain actions that have been stronger than the Obama administration's actions. The Trump administration approved the provision of lethal military assistance to Ukraine, something that President Obama refused to do. We have seen a buildup of U.S. military forces in the region, although that now is being undercut by Trump's impulsive decision to withdraw 9,500 troops from Germany that seems driven largely out of spite because he's having disagreements with Chancellor Merkel. We have seen an increase in American LNG, liquefied natural gas, to the region, even to Belarus, of all places. And we have seen sanctions stay in place despite the efforts in the very first week of the Trump administration in January 2017 to lift those sanctions. So you have those sets of actions, but then on the other side, you have Trump's rhetoric, and the two simply don't go together. Trump refuses to criticize Putin. Remember the Helsinki summit in the summer of 2018, where Trump said he is more inclined to believe Putin than his own intelligence community about interference in the 2016 election. Remember where Trump has been asked by journalists numerous times about the murders of journalists, and he says, well, the United States is not so innocent either. And then, of course, this latest situation with the news reports starting last Friday of Russian GRU unit offering bounties, offering payment to members of the Taliban and other fighters to kill American soldiers in Afghanistan. And the reaction of President Trump to this has been, it's fake news.
What should be the reaction, sorry?
Well,
which suggestion would you, what will you suggest in this regard?
It shouldn't be an invitation to Putin to come to the United States, to Washington in September for a meeting of the G7, G8, G10, whatever it's going to be. It should be a very clear message that if this is true and if it continues, there will be retaliation by the United States. The President of the United States is the commander-in-chief of America's military. And if the Russian GRU is placing a bullseye, a target, providing payments for people to kill American soldiers, then the commander-in-chief, which is the President of the United States, has a responsibility to defend his troops. And that could include a whole range of options. It could include sanctions, it could include cyber attacks, it could include going after Russian forces in Syria. And remember, in 2018, there was a push by the Wagner mercenary forces against U.S. forces and U.S. supported forces in Syria. And U.S. military planes targeted and killed some 200 to 300 Wagner forces. There is speculation that this bounty on Americans in Afghanistan is in retaliation for what happened to the Russian mercenaries in Syria 2 years ago. There's an enormous difference. American forces in Afghanistan are trying to provide peace and stability and security in Afghanistan. They're not fighting Russians. In Syria 2 years ago, these Russian mercenaries were approaching and threatening American forces and American supported forces. And the United States warned them to back off. They didn't back off. And we were left with no choice but to launch an attack to prevent any shedding of blood of American forces then. President Trump should express outrage, as members of Congress have, including Republican members of Congress, that this is a possibility, that what happened here is in fact true. And so it is mind-boggling, I think, to understand the ups and downs in the relationship, where you have some strong actions on the one hand, and then you have the president, his rhetoric, his invitation to Putin to come to the United States this year, an election year in the United States, when we know that the Russian GRU and the Internet Research Agency and others are already meddling in our election. They're already engaged in the disinformation campaign. So it is stunning to me that President Trump refuses to criticize Putin, extends the hand to Putin, tries to give him a boost at a time when, I'm not calling for war, don't get me wrong, but at a time when we need to really be letting Putin and those around him have it. I'm not advocating for anything against the Russian people. We don't have a problem with the Russian people. We have a problem with the Kremlin and with the Putin regime. That's who we have a problem with. And that's where we need to focus our response when it comes to this Afghanistan issue or any other problem, including interference in our election.
Thanks a lot. I would like to go for the second topic. It's very important for us here in Georgia, and maybe you could put some light on it. You, of course, know about the RSC National Security Strategy document prepared a few weeks ago by some congressmen. And maybe you've heard already about today's article prepared by Congressman Markwin Mullen, where he stated that, again, that Ivanishvili, the ruler of Georgia or leader of the ruling party, is a close ally of Putin, as it was stated in National Security Strategy. And Markwin Mullen says that they are trying to take this Frontera Resources company, attack it, and etc. Could you please explain, because actually in Georgia, we can't understand what's going on in US-Georgia relations. Why is Ivanishvili called Russian Putin's ally? Because we don't see actually any evidences of this. And what's going on with this Frontera company? If you know what happened before and what is the situation now, what people think in DC.
So I don't know all the details here, but let me try to put this in context. There is concern in Washington on Capitol Hill, in the House and in the Senate, about developments in Georgia. Now, of course, there was a recent development that the Georgian parliament passed the constitutional changes that would enable a mostly proportional parliament to be voted on in October, where 120 of the 150 seats would be based on a proportional system. And that was an initiative supported by the United States, by the EU and others. And so seeing this get through after a huge hurdle that was created by Georgian Dream last fall. Keep in mind, this all started a year ago, a little over a year ago, when a Russian parliamentarian came to the Georgian parliament, sat in the speaker's seat, spoke in Russian. He was an advocate and supporter of the annexation or the invasion of Georgia by Russia and the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. This caused, understandably, huge protests in Georgia and in Tbilisi. That then triggered the push to change the parliamentary election system. And Georgian Dream agreed to that and then backed away from it last fall. And then they renewed protests. They reached an agreement in March. Once again, Georgian Dream dragged its feet, particularly when it came to the release of political prisoners. And there's still debate about one political prisoner, Mr. Rura, about whether he is included in that deal. Nevertheless, the parliament supported the change on the way the Georgian parliament will be voted on this coming October. Come 2024, with the next election, it will be an entirely proportional system. I mention all that because the concern in Washington has been that Ivanishvili, from early on, given his background and experience in Russia, making money and his fortune in Russia, has been too close to Russia, and the Georgian Dream has been too accommodating. There has not been enough pushback when it comes to, say, Russian forces pushing the demarcation line further into Georgian-controlled territory, when it comes to dealing with energy issues, when it comes to dealing with trade. And so the concern has been growing in Washington that Georgia, which has been the most pro-American country in the region, is weakening its support for joining Euro-Atlantic institutions, including NATO, including the European Union, and is looking to build better relations with Russia. And so I think there has been a campaign in the United States to paint Mr. Ivanishvili, as you described it, Егор, as a Putin ally and supporter and backer. That may be going too far, but I think there are concerns about the approach of the Georgian government in its relationship with Moscow. One final element to this: there is some responsibility in this for on the shoulders of NATO and the EU. Georgia was told in 2008 at the NATO Bucharest summit that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. It didn't say when, but said that they would become members of NATO. And we haven't seen much progress on that. And I think there is a growing frustration in Georgia that a dozen years since that promise, there hasn't been much progress made. Georgia was also brought into the Eastern Partnership. It signed a visa liberalization agreement with the EU. It signed a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement. But there doesn't seem to be much hope that Georgia is going to be joining as a full member of the EU anytime soon. So I think there is some understandable concern in Georgia that the country is not seeing enough movement in its integration efforts with the EU and NATO. And the feeling perhaps among some is, well, we're always going to border Russia. We may never join NATO and the EU, so we may as well try to make the best of the relationship with Moscow. The problem with that is Mr. Putin does not have good intentions toward Georgia. And so I think Georgian Dream and its leaders and Mr. Ivanishvili need to recognize that Georgia's future lies in the West, and the West also needs to recognize that Georgia's future lies in the West. And we both need to do a better job of deepening the Georgian-Western relationship so that Georgia doesn't feel the only alternative it has is to make up with Moscow.
But does it mean that congressmen or Senate representatives really believe that Ivanishvili is some, like Medvedchuk, because they're close in this list, is really some, I don't know, very, very close person to Putin? Because we don't see like evidences. We know the case of Anaklia Port. We heard about Frontera case, but actually I have no details, and in Georgia we have no details why U.S. congressmen are so active in regard with Frontera. Do you know maybe?
I don't. It's possible that there's a lobbying campaign in Washington. I'm not, since I am in Miami, I'm not.
What does it mean? It's very important what you said now, so I have to ask, what does it mean, lobbying campaign? Is it possible to, because it's discussed here like this, to pay congressmen to say something?
No. So to be clear, if I use the term lobbying campaign, it would mean that an entity in Georgia, the government or opposition or a company, would pay a lobbying firm or a law firm to advocate on behalf of an issue that it supports and represents. it would not mean a payment to it. At least it shouldn't, because this is illegal. You cannot pay a member of the House or the Senate to take a position that you find beneficial to your side. And so it would mean that you hire lobbying firms, and there are a lot of them, unfortunately, in Washington, to go up to the Hill, to make the case, make the argument, and try to get members to write letters, to draft legislation, and so on. But to be clear, there is absolutely, and again, if it happens, it's illegal, and members of Congress can be prosecuted for this. There is no direct transfer of money going from a Georgian party to a member of the House or even their staff. Staff can't receive such funding either. It goes to a lobbying firm or to a law firm, and
so they just initiate discussions.
Initiate discussions and try to advocate on their behalf, but the transfer of funds would be from the Georgian entity to the lobbying firm, not from either the Georgian entity to a member of Congress or the lobbying firm to a member of Congress. That's illegal.
Do you really, final question, do you personally believe that in Georgia, you know Georgia very well, you know the situation, developments, government or the general course of the country changed from pro-Western, pro-Euro-Atlantic to, I don't know, Kremlin or some other, as congressmen and Senate representatives say from time to time?
So I've been worried about developments in Georgia, and I've been worried about the direction the government's been looking. And this has been a concern of mine now for a few years. I am a frequent visitor to Georgia. I love the country. I love the people. I love the food. It's really my favorite place to visit. I think Georgians are so incredibly warm and hospitable and friendly. And I think most Americans who have been to Georgia recognize, I think Americans fall in love with the country once they get there. It's not easy to get there, by the way. So any criticism that Georgians hear, whether from the government or anywhere else from the United States, is done out of a love and passion and concern for Georgia as friends. Georgia has friends in the United States. It doesn't have any enemies. And if there are criticisms voiced, it is because they're worried about the direction Georgia's heading. And so I think it's very important that they understand that even if the criticism is sharp, even if the criticism hurts, it's not done out of any nefarious intention. It's done out of a sense of concern that Americans are worried about the direction that Georgia's heading. And some of it may be targeted at certain individuals. I haven't been shy in voicing my concern about some of the decisions the government has taken. And I don't pretend that the opposition is perfect either. I think there is a need for the opposition and the government to work together, given the extraordinary circumstances Georgia faces, which is tremendous pressure from Moscow, a pandemic which the government and society have handled amazingly well, so much better than my country has handled. But that, there's always a possibility, given the countries around Georgia, of a resurgence in the country. You have to be very careful, given the need to develop economically, the need to integrate more deeply into the Euro-Atlantic institutions. The elections coming up are going to be very important. And I think a lot of Americans will follow them with great interest. And we're not rooting from one side or the other. We're rooting for a good, free, and fair election. Let the Georgian people decide whom they want to have as their leaders. And then we look forward in the United States to working both with, if it's new leaders or the current leaders who stay in power, and the opposition, but just as importantly, with civil society, with the media. All of these elements are so important.
I'm very sorry. I have to ask one more thing. A week ago, maybe you know, maybe you don't. I will tell you now. So a week ago, Georgian government representatives started campaign, like anti-fake campaign, making bloody logotypes of main TV channels like Formula, TV Preveli, and Tavari Arhi, main TV channel. So they stated that all opposition TV channels are fake news, and they distribute disinformation, and state security started some cases against main channel. So do you consider all of these actions are being considered in Washington, D.C. as well, and that's why such letters appear from time to time?
Let me be clear in saying that the United States needs to be quite humble in its criticism of any other government's attacks on the media when the President of the United States accuses the media of being the enemy of the people, and points at them in crowds and says that's fake news. Those are the enemies. That said, I think it is critically important that the Georgian government refrain from attacks on the media. And I hope they understand that the media play an incredibly important role. The media also have a responsibility to be fact-based in their reporting, to be objective. There's a difference between opinion and editorial and the actual news of various operations. We're entering elections both in the United States and in Georgia, where attacks on the media, I'm afraid, are likely to continue. It doesn't mean that they should, but I think attacks on media, particularly if they're viewed as opposition media, are something that is likely to generate a reaction in the United States that will be critical and negative. So I hope the Georgian government stays away from attacking the media. I hope all Georgian parties stay away from attacking the media. I hope the Georgian media do a good job in reporting on the situation. Things will get tense the closer we get to elections, and that's going to be true here in the United States as well, where I think the President of the United States, unfortunately, will continue his attacks on the media. And so, again, I offer this
very good example
based on with a lot of strong dose of humility, if you will.
Understood. Sounds actually a bit sad, not very optimistic. If situation in the United States is like that, what we want, what we ask from other countries?
You know, but I will say this. Look, there are those from Hong Kong to Moscow, to you know, Miami, Washington, you name it. People who go out in the streets who demand justice, demand freedom, demand democracy, demand respect for human rights. Obviously, it helps when the United States is a leader in this cause. But even when we are sort of pulling back and dealing with our own problems, I am very encouraged by seeing incredibly brave, strong people like yourself and others who insist on a better life, respect for freedom, a democratic process. And as long as that happens, I'll remain optimistic.
Thanks a lot. Thank you for the interview.
Thanks, Егор. Good to see you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.